Hello and welcome to another episode of Leaders of Transformation. Today we're going to talk with Nic Marks, who is in England, and he's been described as a statistician with a soul. So he has this unusual combination of hard statistical skills and soft people skills, which he draws on. And he has been very successful in working with government bodies, the UK government, on how to measure population well-being. He did a 2010 TED Talk on his work, and that TED Talk was actually watched over 2 million times. He's a very in-demand speaker and workshop leader and works with companies speaking on this topic of happiness and so much more, actually. He's the founder of Friday Pulse, and we'll talk about that as well. So, Nic, welcome to Leaders Transformation. We're excited that you're here today. Thanks
so much for asking me.
Yeah, you know what? We met on LinkedIn, which is super awesome. You know, I still have clients of mine who say, "Oh, do I need to be on LinkedIn?" I'm like, you have no idea the amazing people that you get to meet around the world. Like, how would we have ever met otherwise, right? Yeah. So I so appreciate you reaching out and us doing this. So let's talk about, I just gave a very quick sketch on a little bit about who you are, but there's so much more. I could read your whole bio. We'd be here for 10 minutes. But can you tell us a little bit more about what you do and who you work with?
Yeah. So as I said, I'm a statistician, and I think numbers are powerful, sometimes more powerful than they should be. And I used to work with governments about how do they measure quality of life, progress, well-being. And really it's because my critique was of how do governments measure that stuff. GDP is basically the main measure, and it's perfectly fine measure of economic activity, but it's not a good measure of human welfare. So I came with a critique to that work. And when I did my TED Talk in 2010, I'd been doing that work for about 15, 20 years. And I thought, well, maybe I'll do something different now. And I didn't do something very different, but I decided that I would think about how businesses measure employee experience. I felt they did it really poorly. I didn't think engagement was a good measure. If you ask someone how engaged you are, they can't actually tell you what that means. They don't know what it is. So, and it's kind of a code word for productivity from the business's side, and so that doesn't necessarily land well with the employee. So I thought, well, I could do better. And it's taken me a while to get to what I think is a good solution. But we started to launch Friday Pulse last year, and it's called Friday because on a Friday, we ask you, how was your week? And the idea is if you measure people's experience every week, you get a very dynamic, responsive indicator about employee experience. And then you can stack that data up in the organization, and senior leaders can see how each team is faring, and particularly how resilient they are, because resilience, in my opinion, is that bounce back, like you're going along and then you go down and you come back up again. And so it gives them very useful data. It's very predictive data about when people are likely to leave, innovation, creativity, productivity, all linked to it. So it's in a similar way, it's a critique of how they do it now, but actually the brilliant thing now for me is that we actually have a solution. When you're working with governments, it's such a slow process. It's like, you're in committees and there's all sorts of people. So I was more in a sort of pressure group then, whereas now I've built a whole platform and solution. So that's quite rewarding.
So are you saying that you could actually tell when somebody's ready to leave or preparing to leave?
We always respect the anonymity of the actual individual. You're talking about risks and probabilities for organizations. Right. So if you see areas of the business where people particularly have become unhappier, then you're likely to see, higher staff turnover pretty quickly next quarter, actually. So, and we have, we use things called correlation coefficients in statistics, which is basically the strength of the relationship. So from that, we can basically estimate that if people drop by a certain amount, then 20% higher staff turnover next quarter than they would have had. So, things like that really turn into the dollars and the pounds, really.
So how do you actually measure happiness? Like, how do you gauge then whether or not somebody is on the upswing or sort of, how do you actually do that personally and also in the workplace? Because I'm sure the personal ties into what's going on in the workplace because they bring themselves.
Yeah. so that, I mean, the measurement side is not very different at work than in life, and there are different ways of measuring it. But basically, the principle is that you're the expert of your own happiness. So I don't know until I ask you. So it's a question of asking and listening, you know, which is always good management and good leadership anyway. So we ask people in a very structured way. So we will ask people a question like, you know, how have you felt this week at work? And so we're asking for felt experience, and the idea of that is that our emotional experience is the way that we gauge things. You know, we say, I'm happy with this, I'm not happy with it. So we tap into that idea. We say this week, we say at work to do the context, and this week to time frame it. And that's how you get a responsive indicator that goes up and down. But there are other schools of thought for measurement. So you can do things like bleep people at different times of the day. How happy are you now? And then that's called experience sampling. It gives really good data. It's really annoying for the respondent because you just get a bleep, and the response rates aren't so great because people forget about it. And they're particularly not great when experience is very good, actually, because when you're in the flow of a good experience, you don't want to interrupt it. You'll ignore it. If it's very bad and you're bored, you might answer it. So you get a skew in the data that way. But then another thing you can do is ask people overall, how happy are you at work overall? And that's called a cognitive assessment. And you might do that in a staff survey if you're doing them once a year. And it's a typical engagement survey is once a year, and you're looking back over the whole year. You're not looking back over the whole year is the truth of it, because you can't remember back to the beginning of the year. But so you just basically get a snapshot. And actually, if COVID has taught us anything, it's life moves very quickly. And, you know, we've been collecting data on clients all the way through that every week. And you see this sort of curve of how people, you know, huge setback, huge knock in March, and, you know, coming through May, June into July, you know, some recovery, not quite back to where it was before, actually, still. So you see that data as a sort of flow, and the week is about right. I've experimented with doing it daily, fortnightly, monthly, and week is because we kind of work in week sprints, and that's the natural way we think about it. So it's a good time at the end of an episode to do it. So that's sort of how we capture the happiness bit. But then, of course, there's all the drivers towards that. You know, what causes happiness and what are the differences between it. And that gets more nuanced, and you have different ways either of measuring it or deciding you're not going to measure it. You're basically going to use more qualitative approaches to do that, catching text and things like that.
So it's interesting. I find this stuff fascinating, you know, and I know actually just was reading a book by the Dalai Lama. It was somebody that was actually authored it. I forget what his name was, but it was about the conversation with the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, Bishop Desmond Tutu. Yeah. And they were talking about I forget the name of the book, but something like The Joy of Happiness or The Power of Joy or something like that. And really fascinating when you get into this. And I think self-awareness is got to be a big part of this, because when you ask somebody how happy they are, I mean, do they even know, you know, what happiness is? Because, you know, it's like so often I find that we don't even know how you ask somebody, how do they feel? They're not even sure that they can pinpoint the feeling, the emotion that they're actually having in the moment.
It's very true. And it's like anything, it's the reflective. So it's a reflective process. And actually one of the things I did when I was young, I trained as a therapist as well as working as a statistician. And so the process is to take some time each week to reflect and to pause. And quite often people don't pause to ask themselves, how am I? Or how happy am I? Or, you know, and it seems to me rather tragic that we don't pause, because our lived experience is, I mean, that's what life is. And so if we don't stop and think, is it going well for us? Is it not? You know, you're going to end up in situations which are suboptimal for you, not as good as they could be for you. And so that awareness building and maturation process, which is partly natural, you know, as we get older, we do become more reflective, and things happen, you know, things happen to us sometimes through our own fault, sometimes by not our own choosing. And you sort of pause and you think, how could I stop that? Because we're reflective, intelligent beings. But the more we do that, actually, the happier you're likely to become, because you'll basically reflect more on the choices that you make. And this is in your personal life and your work, you know. And so actually, Friday Pulse is in some ways inspired by that thought of take some time out each week. How was this week? What went well? What didn't go well? How can I build on what did go well? How can I deal with what didn't go well? And how do you do that as a team? Particularly, we're quite team based because happiness is very relational. Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for economics, but basically he's a psychologist. He said that happiness is almost a social emotion. It's sort of between us. Now, there are forms of happiness that are quite private, contentment, but there's all sorts of forms of happiness which are very social, enjoyment, laughter. Some are more even sort of societal with sort of inspiration and awe and things like that, where you're getting into bigger things bigger than yourself. So there's different forms of happiness, but most of them are social. And it's, like most people will have met the person that they end up bonding with in a relationship when they were in a good mood. They won't have done it when they're in a bad mood. I mean, if you're angry, people are going to stay away from you. If you're happy, they're going to come towards you. And there's that whole nuance of how relationships are formed to do with our emotional state at the time.
Yeah, that reminds me of Jim Harris wrote a book called Learning Paradox, and then there's another one on emotional intelligence, and he talked about the fact that you actually attract people that are at a similar emotional level. So if you're in a bad mood, you might attract somebody, but you're not necessarily going to attract the happy person. You're going to attract the person who's kind of on the same level, and you're bonding, but you're bonding, let's say down here in toxicity or in unhealthiness versus up here. So yeah, very interesting. I'm curious actually in terms of countries. I know that Bhutan has been rated as one of the happiest places. I saw a movie years ago where there was this little island somewhere, and I forget the name of it, but this island that had like the highest happiness score, and people lived longer, and they were looking at why, because they were also some of the poorest people in the country, in the world. So how do you, what countries are the happiest? And, because you talked about GDP, and this is a different measurement that is becoming actually a lot more popular. A lot more countries are starting to take this into consideration of how happy their people are. So which countries are the happiest, and what do they do differently to make that so?
Yeah. So Bhutan, I actually used to advise the Bhutanese government on how to measure gross national happiness. So they are not the happiest country in the world. They are really happy for their region because, they're in a difficult region of the world. They've got, Chinese occupied Tibet to the north. They've got Nepal with all its internal strife. They've got India, but the separatist states of Sikkim and like that around them. So they're quite a geopolitical hotspot, and they're pretty good. But they are very good for a developing country, for a medium development country, or actually low to medium development country. The happiest countries come out as Scandinavian, basically, and with some others thrown in there, Switzerland, and that sounds like a bit boring in some ways, but it's actually what's really going on there is not that the Scandinavians are happier than people in the UK or the US. It's that the poor segments of their population are much less unhappy. So they have a distribution of income and you have a distribution of happiness, okay? And there is a relationship between income and happiness, but it's a weak relationship, in that it's not the major driver of your happiness. But of course, money protects you against unhappiness. And they have much better social safety nets in Scandinavia. So the people at the bottom poorest 25% in Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, are much happier than the bottom 25% of income in the UK, and much, much happier than the US. So that's really what the national averages get is not pulled down by those people. But the happiest Swedes, Danes are not very different than the happiest UK, US people. But the unhappy there are more unhappiness in the US and the UK. So it's the ones with more income inequality, basically, that drives those things at a big level. But then probably the most interesting international comparison is between Latin America and Central Eastern Europe. Okay, so the former communist states of Central Eastern Europe. They're very similar levels of GDP per capita, very similar levels of life expectancy, both of them, very different levels of happiness. Latin Americans are much happier than Central Eastern Europeans. What is that? And it's basically community. It's basically social connectedness. In Latin America, very strong sense of family, masses of sort of community groups, very strong local identity. Central Eastern Europe, not. I mean, partly through deliberate strategy through the communist era where they pulled apart communities, but also probably partly much longer history of all sorts of other ways of way families are constructed and whatever. But that's the big difference, and the big difference is connectedness, and music probably too. But
yes, they do like to have fun. That's kind of like the Greeks. So we had a group of Greek friends that came over, and they just love to celebrate and party, and it's kind of a way of life. And so I think of Latin Americans also, same thing. There's a kind of a joie de vivre, if you will.
Huge vibrancy, huge. They had this thing, Pride of Vida, which is good life, and I have a very good older friend. I love it when you have friends that are intergenerational. So he's 80 something now. And I think he's definitely one of my favorite human beings on the planet. And he lives in Chile, and he's just, his way of life is just brilliant. I mean, he's quite fat, and he calls it his curve of happiness. It's like, so this cost me a lot of wine. And he's basically the sort of person that goes, why drink water when you can drink wine? And that's not really very healthy. But I mean, he's a massively big heart and a beautiful soul.
That actually brings up a good point. And we're going to talk about the 5 ways to well-being that you teach. But before we do that, or I don't know if this fits right into this, but when you talk about happiness, so happiness, of course, affects our body, and even people that can be less healthy as your friend who might drink more wine can actually be healthier because of the happiness they choose to embody versus somebody who's super healthy, vegan, even, just like really purist, and yet are emotionally unhappy because they're maybe they're restricting themselves so much, so they're not allowing themselves to have, let's say, wine or anything like that, or foods that are not, quote unquote healthy foods. So do you have any statistics on the difference between that and how happiness actually affects our health?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the biggest thing is, the biggest health indicator is life expectancy. How long do people actually live? Yeah. Because it contains sort of everything within it. And studies sort of suggest that if you're in the happiest sort of 25% as compared to the bottom 25%, you live 7 to 10 years extra. Which is, and in fact, some studies even put it 12 to 15. But it's bigger than body mass index. It's bigger than smoking, much bigger, much bigger. And so these social determinants of health are much stronger than have been realized, and they're much stronger than some of the physiological things. I'm not going to be against eating healthily, and there's obviously total evidence that vitamins, minerals that what you have in your diet are hugely important to our health. But the social determinants are much more. So there's famous studies by I'm forgetting what her Christian name is, but Steven Pinker's wife. I've forgotten her name. That's terrible because I know Steven Pinker better. But anyway, but she's done these big studies, which is basically saying, why is it that women live longer than men? And actually, you can probably make a case that it's about social relationships. Women are better at social relationships. They're more supported. They've got people to talk to about them, and they live longer. A lot of the explanation of the sort of 2, 3 years, 4 years, sometimes that women live longer is about their social relationships. And we see that in marriage data too, that when people get married, both partners tend then to live longer. Women about 2 years longer, mainly explained by more financial security. Men live up to 7 years longer, mainly explained that they stop their bad bachelor behavior. They get more into the realm of social relationships. They take less risks and all sorts of things. And so men actually benefit from marriage much more than women. And I think it's probably something all of us knew for a long time, but it is there statistically. And unfortunately, there's no data on gay marriage yet that really shows that, because it'd be lovely to know if 2 men get together, do they just get the financial security? Do they get the other one? 2 women get married? What happens? I don't know. But there is data that basically starts to unpack that social element of it. It's under thought. I often joke, because I'm heavy, and I often joke that Yeah, but I'm happy. So, I've got 10 years extra life. So if I eat and drink a couple of years of those, it's okay. Yeah, I'm not very good with my food, but I wouldn't want to argue with anyone about not having a good diet.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be an either or, but I
No,
just, just looking at the impact of them is great. So yeah, let's talk about the 5 ways to well-being, because I think about, okay, so countries, and we were talking about doing things differently. It's like, how do they show up? Or, obviously I'm sure you know that, like in the US, anxiety and depression is at an all-time high. And I think that makes a lot of sense given what you were just talking about is, yeah, it seems like we have a lot of connection and community, but it's really disconnected. And even with all of the social media available to us, we are more technologically connected and more emotionally disconnected in the process of that. And so, but I think about, like, how do we right size this? How do we build more happiness for our own life, into our workplace, and also into our communities at large, right? And so from that context, can you talk about the 5 ways to well-being?
Yeah. So these were developed in 2008 when I was in the public policy realm. And I was actually presenting a statistical model to a government group. And I, at the end of it, I picked up a bit of fruit that was in the middle of the table. And I said, we need the equivalent of 5 fruit and vegetables a day, but for people's well-being. And I don't know whether you've heard of this public health dictum that you should eat 5 fruit and vegetables a day. In the UK, it's a very strong message, and the 5 is there. I mean, some countries have 7 and 6, but it's 5 in the UK. So 5 is already thought of as a healthy number. And the guy looked at me and goes, God, we do. I've got a bit of money in my budget. Do you want to do this project? And so I said, yeah. So we did this project. And basically what we did was we went through the literature. The whole project we were working on was gathering data on predictors of well-being. So it was in context. And we went through it, and we drew another data too, but looking at what makes people happier. And we came up with these 5 things. And just to say that they're framed very positively, government tends to message negatively, like don't smoke, don't do this, whatever. We're trying to do very positively. We're also trying to do it in the spirit of being an invitation rather than an order. And so the 5 things we came up with were connect. And our social relationships are the most important determinant of our happiness. And so remembering to build relationships with the people that are most important to you and maintain them. It's like we can let friendships go, we can let marriages go, we can we can not see our children when they grow up, but there's actually remembering that these are the things that really nourish us the most. So relationships connect. Second one is to be active. So the fastest way out of a bad mood is physical activity. So if you and this is not a cure for depression, though it is an antidote to depression, but getting a seriously depressed person up off the couch is difficult. And if they've really got that far, but if you're just mildly in a bad mood or having a bad time, going for a walk, a run, a bicycle, putting on music and dancing, but moving your body is really, really good. So be active. The third one is take notice. And we probably might have used the word mindful, but that came a little later. The mindfulness explosion's really come since 2008. It was there, but it wasn't so thing. But take notice is really, and in a way, it's that bringing awareness we were talking about before. It's like noticing what's going on for you, because that's how you learn, and that's how you understand what's meaningful to you. That's how you understand what you enjoy by doing that. And also, it's about noticing what's going on around you, in that sense of noticing the seasons changing. Being out in nature is very good for take notice. So take notice is the third. Fourth is to keep learning. And we put the word keep there because it's not just about learning at school or formal learning. It can be informal. It can be learning a new dish to cook. It can be picking up a hobby again that you used to do when you were young, whatever it is, but it's learning something new. And we're creatures that like novelty. We actually like stretch and challenge. So that's really important. So that's the fourth one, keep learning. And the fifth one is give. And actually sort of something magical that happens with give, which is that, not only does the receiver feel good, but we feel good. And so, there's this particular bit of research, which was basically testing out retail therapy, which was saying, gave people $100 and they said, go and spend it on yourself. And they gave another group $100 and said, go and spend it on someone else. The people who spent it on someone else were much happier than the people that spent it on themselves at the end. and that, I think we all kind of know that to be true, but it's, it's there in the evidence. And so those are the 5 things. So the connect, be active, take notice, keep learning, and give. And if you incorporate those into your regular daily life, you're most likely to become happier. And and it does require some sense of agency. So if you're severely depressed or something like that, or very, I'm not saying it's a cure-all, but if you're, but even those people who are depressed, if they start trying to do those things, they start to feel better. But in our daily lives, I think we can just forget. And it's like, and what's interesting is that they're not really about money. They're not really about what other people think of you. They're things that you can do without too much money and without, worrying what others think about you. And they're in your control. And even if I look at data on people's income and whether they do the 5 ways, we normally have a curve, which is people from, low income, are less happy than people who've got higher income. It's like this. But if you put in the 5 ways, it's like this. It's the bottom 20% has still got an issue, but the others, it's really about whether they do the 5 ways or not, or somewhat to do with that.
I love about it is, like you just said, it's not about how much money you have. It's not about what other people think about you. And it's not about something like, it's something that you can actually control. No matter what's happening around you, you can still do these 5 things. So you're not controlled by an outside force to determine your happiness, which is a lot of times what happens, right? We were looking for that happiness fix from outside. And of course, there's no, retail shopping is a good example, right? I'm going to feel better if I go do this thing, when what I'm hearing is that the happiness is within. It's really tapping into that. And be, like you said, having a sense of agency, of even just like choosing that for yourself and taking that on, as opposed to counting on someone else. I mean, how many times, like any song, you listen to a song, and what are they, love songs, right? They actually encourage this like dependency, this codependency, you complete me, and it's like, so I can't be happy unless I find the person, that's going to complete me, or things like that, which sets us up to fail ultimately. And even though connection's important, but even if I don't have connection here, I might have connection somewhere else. And what I also hear in that is connecting, which is part of the take notice, is the connecting with yourself and being present with where you're at. And that comes back to what we were talking about earlier, is like, how do I even know that I'm happy, or how do I know how I'm feeling? You got to be aware of it before you can even measure it. So it's good.
Yeah, it is. It is. There are always things within your own control to help yourself be happier. Does not mean to say that circumstances are not massively important. In that, if you're born in sub-Saharan Africa, you're going to struggle much more than if you're born in, into a nice middle-class family like I was in the UK. It's going to be easier for me. So you don't want to disrespect that those inequalities exist, and they really do. And having said that, there's still things within our control.
Yes. And how many times have we, met somebody who's rich and unhappy, and somebody who's poor and very happy, but it's about the quality of their relationships and the quality of their life in terms of even the generosity piece. Really, really good. So your topic better than I will ever know your topic. What have we not talked about? I'm kind of putting you on the spot here. What have we not talked about that it would be good for us to talk about in the context of this idea of creating more happiness in our life?
Well, in the context that your podcast is called Leaders of Transformation, it's like, how is happiness a transformational power? And how, as leaders, can you harness that power in your own organizations or in your own lives? I mean, you talked about the Dalai Lama. There's a Buddhist idea, which is that there is no way to happiness. Happiness is the way. In other words, let's start with happiness. And actually, the core idea behind Friday Pulse is that everyone wins. Everyone wins of happiness, because whilst we don't go to work necessarily for our main source of happiness, we don't want to go to work and be unhappy. In fact, it's miserable. I mean, like me, I'm sure you've had times in your career where you haven't been happy.
Yes.
And it's not good. And you get stressed, and and you probably bring it home, and and it's not good. And you either need to move, or you need to sort out the situation. Or mine was, I needed to move leader. I mean, my manager was just a pain, at that time. I was young, and it was and she was such a pain, actually. And she was a she, which I had a boss above her who was a woman who was brilliant, and I just eventually had to go and complain to her, and she goes, "Oh yeah, she's not very good, is she?" No, can I report to you, please? But anyway, that's a whole nother story. And I think, but in the sense, then that was a leadership problem, in that actually she wasn't good. She was very much someone that told me what I had to do. She obviously hadn't been well managed herself, and she just passed that on. And that's like parenting and all sorts of other things. If you haven't been parented well, it's difficult to parent well. But you have to break this cycle. So I think the leaders need to recognize that actually, if they want to build great teams, then great teams are happy and productive. Okay, that if they're just productive and they're unhappy, that team will not last. It won't be sustainable. It'll break up. If they're happy and they're not productive, well, okay, they're going out of business, So, and we won't even talk about the unhappy, unproductive ones. But the sweet spot is to be happy and productive. And by happy, I don't mean that fluffy playing table tennis happy. I mean that way of respect, that you really like your colleagues, you trust them, you can be brave with them, you can challenge them. So you've got that psychological safety, Amy Edmondson would call it, where you feel like you're safe and you belong in that team. And then you have a great team. And I've managed to do that. I've managed to build, in my humble opinion, 2 great teams. I've had lots of times where I haven't built great teams, but I had one particular one, in the mid 2000s at this think tank, and we did 5 years of great work. And I would say I'm just doing it again now with Friday Pulse, where we've got everyone understanding what we're doing, and collaboration going really, really well. And when you get that, it's not easy to get there, but then things really start flying. And I think that is a leadership responsibility. And that is, I'm not a teacher. I have friends who've been teachers. Teaching is a hard job, because you kind of have to draw it out of the children, don't you? You have to really help them come. And parenting is difficult too. Like, how much autonomy do you give your kids? How much do you tell them what to do? That's attention. And there's not one right way, but that is attention always. And it's the same. Leading teams, leading organizations is how much can you work being facilitative and drawing and helping build people up and get their potential, and how much do you tell them to do? The army model that was to tell people what to do, but I don't think that's the most successful model in business. It's a facilitative style where you help draw people, but in order to do that, you have to kind of give up control. And that's difficult. So that tension is difficult to be a good leader, and it's an art, as well as a science. And I think that's where I think you get the great teams, and that's where you transform organizations, and they do well. And I would bet you any money, if we look back in COVID in about 4 or 5 years time, and we do the analysis, that the organizations that come out well will be the ones that had a good culture before they went into it. Of course, some of them are gone because they're hospitality and they got other things which happen, but the ones that come through it are going to be more likely to have had a great culture. And the ones that have had poor cultures will have just fractured and gone brittle and had more difficulty, even more difficulty. And I don't know what percentage effect that would be of outcome, but I would bet my house on the fact that that overall you have a strong relationship there.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it, Nic. This has been great. And lovely. I know you have a couple of things going on right now. Friday Pulse platform. It's free for 3 months right now. Yeah, so how do they access that? Yeah, so we've opened it up at the beginning of COVID. We realized that clearly it wasn't time for people to spending money. So we said anyone can come along and use our platform. Which is basically a platform for measuring and improving happiness at work. It's very team-based. You can go to our website, fridaypulse.com, and find out about it. And we're just going to keep that going because it's working really well. It allows us to get to know people before they become a paying client, and I think that's better for both sides. They really understand what we're about and how it can help them basically, ultimately, try and do that, transform business, but try and help it rise to be its greatest potential. That's why we have a simple tool like that. A bit like Zero for accounting, but we're for culture. So I'm trying to write a paper at the moment called Accounting for Happiness. But there's because I'm wanting to work with some accountants about how we do this. But anyway, that's who we are. But we also
are launching a partnership program, which is anyone that's a coach or a consultant that's got clients. We can work with you to, we provide content that you might want to use in your newsletters or anything like that. But if people come through our contacts with you, we can either pay you a commission or you can pass that on as a discount to your clients, whichever suits you better. We're just launching that. And so actually by the time this comes out, it will definitely be launched. But if you can't find out about it, then just contact me on LinkedIn. I'm very visible on LinkedIn. So Nic, Nic Marks. I post every week there an article, or just email me direct, Nic, nic@fridaypulse.com.
Fantastic.
And help you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nic. I appreciate it. We'll make sure all the links are in the show notes as well. So for those of you that are listening and can't write it down where you are right now, you'll be able to go to leadersoftransformation.com and you can type in Nic Marks, it's NIC, and this episode will come up and the show notes will be there for you. And yeah, Nic, this has been really, really great. And I think this world needs a lot more happiness. We deserve to experience a lot more happiness, and the more happiness we experience and for ourselves, and the more happiness, like you talk about transforming businesses, as we transform businesses, we're also transforming lives, because those people live, right? They live it. They take that home with them, and it's like this ripple effect that goes out. And so it's very, very impactful when we can impact the workplace and make it a happier place for people to spend a very large portion of their life, there. And so really, really important. I believe that leaders of transformation take action. So I encourage our listeners, and if you're watching on video, is to take action on something. Maybe it's looking at those 5 ways of well-being and ask yourself, how well am I? How can I improve? So I wrote them down. So connect, be active, take notice, keep learning, and give. And start to employ some of those in your life, your personal life, in your workplace. If you're a leader, start looking at how can you incorporate those into your culture, in your company. But it starts with you. It starts with you and I dealing with ourselves and starting to be well ourselves before we can teach others and help others do that as well. So I encourage you to do that. Love to hear your stories. You can go on leadersofttransformation.com. You can reach me through that platform, or you can find us, of course, on social, very active on social. Love to hear how this has impacted you. And if you like this, please share it with a friend. If there's someone else out there, maybe another leader that has been struggling with the engagement levels in their companies, which, there's so many companies out there that right now are struggling with engagement, then maybe this will give them a taste. And then they've got the platform, Friday Pulse. They can start to use fridaypulse.com as a platform for free to start to make some changes and improve the happiness level and ultimately the engagement and productivity level. So I encourage you to share it with them. If you like it, leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcast listening platform. We'd really appreciate that. It really helps us in getting this message out to a wider audience. We've got listeners in over 140 countries, and we just want to continue to expand that out. So we appreciate you. We thank you for supporting what we do here, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Leaders of Transformation real soon.